This video is an in-depth look on Checking Out My History by John Agard from the AQA GCSE Anthology Power and Conflict Poems. Check Out My History is a different poem to the others in terms of the fact that, like most of John Agard's poems, it could be considered performance poetry as much as anything else, and so much of it would come out of the way that Agard would read it. So I would also suggest very strongly that you check out elsewhere on YouTube Agard's own reading of the poem to see how he uses it and moves between the different sections, and even use elements of song. Okay, so what does it help us to know? Certain things to make sure that we understand the key elements of the poem, some of the things that he quotes. First of all, it's important for us to know that, this is kind of the background to the poem, in the 1960s, because of the impact of colonialism, many students in Caribbean countries were taught a British curriculum. Now, going into some of the figures here, Dick Whittington was a historical figure, but is probably best known for the pantomime about him, and particularly for the one featuring his cat, Puss in Boots. Lord Nelson and Waterloo are references to key moments in Britain's fight with Napoleon in the early 19th century. However, Lord Nelson did not fight at the Battle of Waterloo. Waterloo was a land battle. Lord Nelson was in the Navy. Shaka Zulu was a great and fierce warrior, best known for creating the famous Zulu army in South Africa. And the Caribs and the Arawaks were the indigenous tribes of the Caribbean, who largely died out after the Spanish conquest that followed Columbus's landing in America. Now, these things will all come back as you look at them a great. So let's think what happens in here. As we noted there, in the 1960s, with the British curriculum being taught, basically a lot of students were being taught British history rather than anything that was particularly relevant to them, and that's John Agard's starting point. So he tells us that he has been blinded to his own identity in this process, okay? Because the history is largely British, so therefore he's not dealing with his own identity, and identity is central to this poem. He lists a bunch of apparently irrelevant history that he's been taught, and the key that he does is he often part remembers or misremembers. He mixes them up with nursery rhymes and legends as well. But then between these lists, in the italic sections, he tells us of 3 heroes of black history that he has found out about himself. And then concludes that by checking out his history for himself, he's able to carve out his own identity. Now, there are many, many details that we're going to focus in on here, but that's the basic structure. And that really, if you get those 4 elements to it, you get a sense of what the history or what the poem is about. Okay, so let's think about the title, first of all. The title is informal, as we know. It's essentially an idiom, okay, a phrase from language, which is kind of just colloquial accepted with what goes on. And that sets up kind of like the approach to his writing, yeah? Now, even though he uses other examples, the fact history is in there, his focus is on history and its importance, and arguably, particularly, what history actually is. Okay, so let's break this up and start to look at it. The first section, the section in which he kind of sets out the effect it's had on him. Now, I would argue here that we start with what might be interpreted as a tone of anger, okay, or certainly frustration, and the violence of the imagery particularly. Now, it starts therefore with the word them, obviously a colloquial version of them, to describe whoever it is that's doing it. Now, this point made here about them being faceless and shadowy is significant. The point being that it's not important who they are, and maybe it's important that they don't seem like a proper group of humans. It's like some background force, and that kind of reinforces the idea that they have an agenda behind it without having to actually say this. And then that forced by these quite violent images here, yeah, blinding him to his own identity. As it says there, it does actually suggest that it's a deliberate attempt to do it, and an incredibly violent one, you know, an attempt to actually blind somebody. And the sense of bandaging up your eye. Also, you know, bandage is usually used to heal, to control. It's a sense almost that having blinded you, they're then trying to bandage you up and say, look, we're helping you. Look, we're helping to cure you. So there's a sense underneath of manipulation going on. And the very fact that the bandage that they use is his own history, according to this. In other words, placed up so it's his own history is used up close, he can't see it, it's covering up his ability to see beyond it and see its significance. Maybe suggests the way that his history is actually being used within the curriculum. When we move into the main section then, this is the pattern that it generally takes, with the exception of the third one where we get two of these quatrains at the beginning. We get a sense of, we always have this pattern of quatrain that deals with what he is taught, what he is told generally, and then this more relaxed, more flowing italics passage, much more poetic, in which he deals with what he's found out for himself, therefore creating this contrast between the quite staid and dull history and pointless history he's being taught and the interest and beauty and open possibilities of what he has discovered for himself that has proper significance. But it's worth looking at the details. The mention of 1066 and all that, it's the most famous date in British history. But the question I would always say to you is, why? Yes, it's the Battle of Hastings. We all know that. But why is it important? And I think that, even though he doesn't say it straight away, is underlined by the and all that. It's another piece of useless information. Yes, 1066 and all that was a name of a famous book that took a kind of like light-hearted look at the way English history is taught. That may be some reference there, but it's not easy to bring into a discussion about the poem. Much easier and much more relevant, I would think, to suggest that idea of look at the facts we all know, but what's the point of that fact if we don't know its significance? It's just all that. We get back to the Dick Whittington thing that we brought in. Even though he's important, all he knows is he had a cat. Again, hardly the significance of history. And immediately what's established is not only as what he's being taught about irrelevant to him, but what he remembers about it shows no importance at all. So when he goes into the Toussaint Louverture thing, Toussaint sounds a fascinating character that many of us don't know about. We say his writing is much more poetic, and he focuses on the qualities he has, and you know, with vision gets his line straight away. Now, we didn't get that with Dick Whittington 1066. We don't get the importance. He is a slave with vision, and maybe even the juxtaposition of those ideas of what he had to go to, and the ability for him to keep vision, to keep a sense of a greater vision, is more important. It's certainly impressive what he apparently appears to do, knocking back Napoleon, establishing the first Black Republic. But at the end of this, what he does, is worth noting here, is using light imagery, the beacon of the Haitian Revolution. All three sections use light imagery to create this sense of enlightening not only his people, but also enlightening those who come after into their identity. The point being here, what have 1066 and Dick Whittington and the pointless information he knows about that got to do with who Agard is? Who Agard is being stressed by the way that he is writing in his own dialect, okay? And then the much more relaxed and flowing and interesting, exciting ideas about someone who struck a blow for black people in establishing the first Black Republic, a beacon for everybody. Now we follow the same pattern as we move on here to the next section. Up here we get a bunch of supposedly irrelevant information but mixed in with a nursery rhyme. So first of all, the man who discovered the balloon comes in. There's so many things you can go with here. First of all, how important are hot air balloons, as we said, right? Because I think that's what he's talking about. How important are hot air balloons to know about? I don't know why I've got the it on the end there. They were, they don't really have any pattern in human history. They've never been a major mode of transport. Then, of course, there's the word discover. As I said, surely no one discovered it. And then the fact he doesn't even remember their name. They're just some bloke who discovered a balloon. Again, pointless information, and he remembers nothing of any importance about it anyway. Juxtaposed straight away with things that he remembers about the rhyme of the cow jumping over the moon. Now, yes, it's a silly children's nonsense rhyme, but he's using it here alongside history to remind himself of the things that he's been told. He takes one of the silliest nursery rhymes, and through the rhyme in particular, attaches the silliness of a cow jumping over the moon and a dish running over the spoon to finding out about discovering the balloon, but also to the much more interesting story of Nanny the Maroon. Now again, the link to Toussaint's here. The language suggests the idea of vision, of something far more important, seeing beyond what is in front of her. So again, the contrast with the dull, factual information that he relates elsewhere. And I noted there that it's a nice, interesting contrast with being blinded in the opening to his own identity, the fact that they all had vision beyond that. And then again, firewoman struggle goes with light imagery. Now, it might be quite interesting to note that his information about Nanny the Maroon doesn't actually make very clear what she did. Now, whether that's just purely because he wants to keep to this more poetic idea of the inspiration of her, or whether he's opening it up for us to go and look up more about her, you take that up to whatever you... But we do have this sense of hope and freedom coming in. Again, you don't need to know a great deal about Black history to know the importance of hope and freedom. And so maybe that is far more important than the facts of what she actually does. So if we go into the next section, first of all, we have, as I said, a couple of these quatrains coming in. The first one dealing with Nelson and Waterloo, and that's compared with Shaka the Great Zulu. Now, it must be considered, especially when you put Columbus next to it as well, that this is a stanza, maybe why it comes in and stands almost on its own, a stanza that deals with colonialism. And it's right at the heart of the poem, absolutely almost dead centre of it. So it's like he's hitting the big issue here. Now, by confusing, deliberately apparently, Lord Nelson and Waterloo, two different events in defeating Napoleon, I suppose brings out the idea of the lack of relevance for him. And I've pointed out there the comparison with Toussaint earlier, who obviously does have relevance for him and also defeated Napoleon. But again, the rhyme and the couplet itself allow him to compare that to Shaka Zulu, and therefore make us think of the difference between the two. And I suppose clearly in his eyes he's thinking, well, they're both great leaders of sorts. Why is one seen as less than the other? When we then deal with the whole idea of Columbus, as it says there, we are dealing with something that is notoriously divisive anyway. Whether Columbus is a hero for his exploration and, in quotes, discovery of America, of course it was already there, as we know. And again, a mention of a date, another famous date, often remembered in a rhyme particularly, maybe of therefore very little significance. But it allows him to then turn the story around and say, okay, I know about Columbus, but what I don't know is about the people who were there originally, who effectively died out, at least in part due to what Columbus did. And as that is the land he comes from, then he's much more interested in indigenous tribes. Of course, Agard is well aware that this is not his ancestry. His ancestry comes through slavery, but it is much more interesting to him to see the victims of all of this, because that aligns again very much with this sense of colonialism and how it affects everybody. So we take this then into the next comparison between the quatrain and the detail that comes in here. So with Florence Nightingale, and then he's going to tell us about Mary Seacole. Now the two of them, of course, are very heavily linked. They're both figures in the same war. They're both known for their nursing. Florence Nightingale is held up as a hero. Mary Seacole, although much more known about these days, Mary Seacole has been relegated more to the background. So what he then throws in is that Florence Nightingale is best known for being the lady with the lamp, rather than any understanding of her actual genuine importance in introducing modern nursing methods. Again, the way that history is being taught is as much the target as actually what is being taught. In between, mixes in Robin Hood and King Cole, old King Cole, again, legend and nursery rhymes, as though they're placed on the same level, which is ridiculous. Meanwhile, when we go into Mary Seacole, we do get this clear picture of her story. We get again the same ideas of her the focus on light. She's a yellow sunrise to the dying, and also star. And the interesting thing of the star and the sunrise contrasting with the lamp, the nightingale, as though she brings natural light as opposed to artificial. So what we get at the end is essentially a repeat of the opening with adaptation. So it has this kind of circular edge to it, slightly differently put out. It's fun, interesting that he doesn't put what I want to tell me on their own, almost as though he's racing through quicker. But the changes, therefore, in the ending are what's important. Not only has bandaging up his eye with his own identity become to checking out, as though he's taken the bandage off and he's looking for himself, and also but the blinding has turned into carving out, as though the permanent action has now become his. Okay, carving being a very permanent but also artistic act in many ways, coming out of there. Now, I've also noted that the hard alliteration of the B, the bandage, and the blind, plosive sounds, essentially, has changed to the softer checking and carving. Okay, and there's that point that they're self-deterministic. I mentioned at the beginning how you can see the anger early on. What I think is that the poem represents a softening of that anger. As he discovers more about the true nature of history, he discovers more about his identity. And that is where that idea of carving out comes as the perfect ending. Okay, so let's look at the form overall. Now, obviously, first of all, we've got Jamaica dialect. It is characteristic of his poetry, but it is also, as it says, they're uncompromising. I am going to write in my dialect. Why not? Okay? We've got that idea of the circular nature. The beginning comes back at the end with a subtle change. The violence of what's done to him becomes ownership. It's almost suggesting what the perfect response is to the kind of suppression that he has to undergo. Then we've got this idea of the simplistic quatrains, sound like nursery rhymes, being contrasted with the sections in italics in a flowing freestyle, which sound more poetic and crafted. It's also worth noting things such as the lack of punctuation within there, the way, therefore, he's almost choosing to express it in his own way, which kind of goes along with his use of dialect. So how does this fit in with the big ideas, and particularly the ideas of Well, first of all, it's a look at the power of societies in the way that, say, Kamikaze is, and to a degree, Exposure and Ozymandias as well. The suggestion here is the power that people in society have to control. By using dem, as we say, it essentially creates this figure of a shadowy group, okay, who aren't particularly human, just in the background controlling, and use of that word blind works there. As we dealt with at the beginning, the significance of blinding and bandaging up, he appears to be convinced it's deliberate, and then the idea of bandaging them up almost again is a sense of manipulation. And obviously, therefore, there seems to be a race motivation in there. It's important then to note, if you see that he's establishing them, it's the fact that he mocks them through mixing up their history and misunderstands their history with pantomime, rhymes, legends. He is making them seem foolish, questioning the validity of what's taught. And then he chooses people and events that have little to no significance for him in those ideas, which allows him to question that thing at the beginning. What history's true value is, what even is history. Now, we talked about the change of the emotions across it, and the emotional impact has huge power in here. It is emphasised through repetition, through the simplistic repetitive rhyme in the quatrains in particular. Yeah, growing anger, but also the simplicity of what actually is being said and taught. They said, if you look at it on the page, and in the anthology it tends to be across 2 pages, so you see the second half a little bit more, and you see that his own history begins to dominate more and more as it goes along, not just in the italics, but also in him mentioning other people like Shaka and the Caribs and the Arawaks that he wants to know about. So that leads to a receding of the harsh that goes through. And finally, we get the power of humanity. First of all, the sense he's telling us, and identity is, definitely a thing that you could be asked about. The idea that we have the power to take control of our own identity through our own research. That history is something we can do for ourselves, not just be taught by people in power. And therefore we cannot be controlled as it appears we can. The 3 figures of black history he chooses, we say here, are examples of empowerment, and different examples of empowerment. Fighting against the establishment, a slave defeating Napoleon, a woman helping slave to freedom, and a nurse who refuses to take the establishment's no for an answer. A lot of dealing with the aspect of slavery here. So essentially, his message appears to be one of hope. It appears to be one that that history is vital to your identity, but in many cases you have to take a sense of a self-deterministic approach to it. The history is also something that can be used as a tool of oppression, very much what people choose to tell as they go through.